Dias a todos, a todas, todes. Bom dia, bonjour, guten Tag. I will start in English. So my name is Mariana. I'm affiliated with the Max Planck and the Federal University of Pará. And I'm here today chairing this session on empirical perspectives on environmental justice and indigenous epistemologies. We have three papers for today, starting with, let me open the file, Yolanda Lopez Maldonado. She's in the room, right? Hello, Yolanda, nice to meet you. We will start with your paper. You have between 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll follow the order that we have in the program. And after it, we are going to receive some comments by Leslie Cloud. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Yeah. Okay. Why don't you stay here, right?
Come on. How do you do?
Yeah.
I start to
What do you
I want to share the PowerPoint.
Yeah. Usually, yeah, usually that's
Okay.
Do you present from here, I suppose? Right?
I don't know. I don't do anything.
That's the best way.
Yeah,
Perfect. Well, that's I think.
Yolanda, can start. Thank you. See when I put next.
Thank you very much. Bonjour à tous. Aujourd'hui, on va parler anglais. Je peux parler en espagnol. Qu'est-ce que vous préférez?
I
Qu'est-ce que vous préférez?
Spanish or
English? Okay. My name is Yolanda Lopez Maldonado. I'm originally from Mexico. I'm an indigenous Maya woman, and I'm currently working on different aspects of nature conservation, but my work emphasizes methodologies from the natural and social sciences from an indigenous perspective. And today I will talk about the importance of decolonizing Earth observations and what the need to work towards more ethical monitoring of the planet. Next slide. To give an overview of my work, my PhD was on Earth systems, and my work emphasizes a lot how indigenous peoples observe and monitor complex systems on Earth. We live on a very dynamic planet that is shaped by our human activities and also natural processes. And it is, from my perspective, is in our own collective interest to observe and understand how our planet changes and the behavior of it. So we need long-term observations, not only from Western scientific approaches, but also from other knowledge systems, not only indigenous, because the problems we face as humanity in this planet are very complex and are not possible to, so we are not able to solve all these problems with only one lens. So we need different vision, different knowledge systems. Next slide, please. And one of these knowledge systems is the knowledge of indigenous peoples about the environment. I would like to emphasize here that there are different knowledges. For example, indigenous knowledge comprises several aspects. One of them is, for example, the knowledge about nature, the knowledge about textiles, the knowledge about arts. And here in my presentation, I will emphasize the knowledge about natural phenomena. Indigenous peoples were among the first to observe changes on Earth and to notice changes also in nature, and to gain and to adapt to those changes. Next slide, please. So I'm not gonna discuss a lot about who are indigenous peoples and where are located. I just want to present this map about the lands managed and controlled by indigenous peoples that was published a couple of years ago Indigenous peoples are spread in more than 90 countries, manage a quarter of the world land surface, and protect more than 80% of the most important biodiverse areas, despite they represent less than 6% of the world population. And one specific aspect is that indigenous peoples confer important connections and spiritual and cultural connections to nature. Next slide. So essentially, indigenous peoples have not only knowledge, but they develop Earth observations that are very precise and accurate about this natural phenomena, and is the topic I will discuss today and I will talk today. This information is very detailed, is on local scale, and it brings and gives us characteristics of how components of the planet functions and work. And this information can support global monitoring efforts. Also, this information can provide a rich data set and documentation with high level of detail that sometimes global models, for example, the IPCC have these climate change models, do not capture the local scale. So that's why it's very important. Next slide. So essentially, indigenous peoples have their own systems of knowing the world, collecting data, categorizing it, using it, recording it, disseminating it, etc. Indigenous peoples, they also have their own protocols for data collection, approaches, and monitoring. One important characteristic, as I mentioned before, is that this particular knowledge is very complex and sophisticated, and it has been described as a bond up with sense of community. It embraces spiritual and moral relationships with nature, like human-nature interactions. And the important part is that many accomplishments on this regard were made before, prior to the arrival of Europeans. So today I will give you a couple of examples how this indigenous knowledge, this indigenous information, these observations are very precise, and I will emphasize the water system across the hydrological cycle, but essentially indigenous peoples, they have been able to observe other systems on the planet, like food systems, climate systems, to mention a few. Next slide, please. I will discuss today about specifically the hydrological cycle, and as you can see in this figure, it's very complex. So we have groundwater, we have lakes, we have ocean, everything is interconnected. We cannot separate one system from another. I will give you just a few examples of how accurate indigenous peoples are in monitoring those systems. Next slide, please. So we have, for example, the cryosphere, including snow, glaciers, permafrost, and everything that is around ice. So for example, we have modern technologies like satellites, biooptics, drifting platforms. Those very modern technologies are available for data collection in Arctic environments, but indigenous peoples' Earth observations about the cryosphere processes, for example, how the sea ice changes, how snow can, the snow cover dimension, like it is certain level, etc. Is very precise and accurate and can help characterize and merge spatial and temporal scales. And this can support global monitoring efforts. And for example, the observations that indigenous peoples from the Arctic can obtain can help to understand, for example, mass balance calculations of land ice and implication for sea level rise, etc. Those are just a few examples. Next slide, please. I have examples of lakes. For example, in Canada, First Nations and water is always interrelated. Lakes are very important in inland water transportation systems and the best source of fresh water on the planet. And for some nations in Canada, some First Nations in Canada, lakes have been governed through indigenous, international, regional, and local relationships. Indigenous peoples not only have understandings and knowledge about this governance, but also accurate data on the dynamics of the physical, chemical, and biological properties of water only by observing. And I'm saying this because indigenous peoples, they started to do all this monitoring and observations without the technology we have today. Next slide, please. I have examples also about groundwater. We have the example of the Falak in Oman and Iran. Falaks are subterranean tunnels or open channels that drains out groundwater of valley runoffs. And they have been a crucial water source across the Iranian plateau and Oman over the past millennia. Those were modifications to the landscape made by those groups, and they were very successful in managing their water resources. Similarly, we have in Mexico the groundwater management by the Mayas, from which we came from. The Mayas were very good at managing their water systems. The hydraulic how do you say hydraulic system was tailored to the biophysical conditions, and they were able to adapt and to engineer the evolving needs of the population. So they were able to use those cenotes or natural sinkholes to collect water, but also there were other ways for data collections like chultunes. They were also able to filter water using natural resources such as zeolites and zeolite materials. We have, for example, understandings and observation of the oceans, like the ETAC navigation system. From some groups from the Pacific Islands, they were able to navigate long distances without the modern technology, only by understanding and reading the stars. And the knowledge they have is very sophisticated, and now there are different activities to bring back the knowledge with the youth. Next slide. We also have the Carolinian Star Compass. As you can see, it's also complex. Carolinian navigators were very good also at navigating by reading the stars, and they were able to develop their own compass in which some points are spaced unevenly. And yeah, so I'm not gonna go into detail because we are going to take a lot of time, but I just wanted to bring examples. Next slide, please. Also, whether long-term forecasting, changes on climate, and observations about the atmosphere. For example, the Maya as well were very good at observing the behavior of the seasons, changes, variations in the trajectories of the sun, the stars, etc. And they managed to record information in the construction of astronomical temples and buildings dedicated to their gods. And of course, this required deep knowledge of mathematics, geometry, acoustics. This is an example of the Maya calendar Shopkin that was used for weather forecast and predictions, and it involves profound observation of nature, etc. Next slide, please. But not also methods, also indigenous peoples, they possess their own frameworks, and this is an example, the Mi'kmaq knowledge, which embraces learning to see from one eye with the strength of indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing. So this is also an example of a framework that can be used for research inquiry. Next slide, please. Also philosophies. One example is the Ayllu system from the Andean communities. Next slide. This Ayllu system constitutes the Tumac Kausai, or the right living, is rooted in an indigenous worldview in which the concept rest on an understanding of an harmonious humanity's relationships with nature. So I just want to finalize my talk with some of the most common myths that scientists have about indigenous knowledge. And one is that indigenous knowledge is imprecise and difficult to understand. This is not true, because indigenous knowledge provides information, methods, practices, tools, philosophies for the conservation and sustainable use of ecosystems and biodiversity. And this information can enrich our understanding of environmental change. I bring this morning to you examples of this precise knowledge and the measures indigenous peoples and observations as predictions that indigenous peoples made, and they continue to. Next slide, please. Another myth is that indigenous knowledge must be combined with Western sciences. I think this is a commonly accepted idea, but this can lead to serious erosion of knowledge, particularly in groups that have lost important amount of knowledge about the environment and languages. And this perhaps do not lead to construct new knowledge at its maximum potential, since the instruments come from Western and other methodologies and approaches. So my final remarks is our planet is constantly evolving and all knowledge systems must be involved. We need to include indigenous knowledge in these observations and understandings of the planet. The methods and frameworks for observing should be informed by indigenous intellectual traditions. A real transformation is possible only by restoring, revitalizing, and recovering such knowledge. And that's all from it.
Thank you, Yolanda. Thank you for the presentation and for sticking to your time. Now we have the second paper by Marlene Paiva Almonte. Marlene is research concentrates on international environmental law, climate change law, and governance and human rights. She currently works as a senior researcher at the Arctic Center of the University of Lapland. Marlene, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you, everyone. Good morning. Good morning to everyone. I will do my presentation in English. I prepared it in English, thinking that I didn't know that multiple options are available. Unfortunately. So, I think this blends a lot, very well with the remarks that Yolanda made in the previous presentation. So thank you for that. I would now present a perspective paper, which is in working process, but is going to be published in the Nordic Research Journal on Arctic Studies and Sami Indigenous Law Systems. So the title of it is Interrogating International Environmental Law Approach to Nature, and in question is an Arctic model. Yes, it is a legal perspective, and it is a perspective from the Arctic region, where there is a Sami indigenous population that is the only one in Europe, that also brings a lot of perspectives about the environment and the earth, the observations of the earth systems, particularly in the cryosphere, as it has been pointed out by Yolanda, that it was that the system of glaciers, snow, the permafrost that is so important, and sometimes like below the Arctic region is thinking that it's common to think that what happens in the Arctic that stays in the Arctic, or it doesn't have a real effect on what happens in the rest of the planet. So, thank you. So just to situate us geographically, the Arctic is this area around the Arctic Circle, the circumpolar north, and it comprises 8 states, nations that are the United States, Canada, Russia, Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark through Greenland, actually. So these 8 nations, to give a bit of background, they are organized in a governance system that is centralized in the Arctic Council, and this is a regional organization that leads, regulates, or leads the governance in the Arctic, but it has been based on cooperation, particularly on research. So there is no such a military cooperation or like other regional organizations, but it is more about how to deal with Arctic regions among Arctic states called Arctic nations. However, just a final remark, there have been, they have indigenous peoples in the Arctic have a status also in the Arctic Council, and they have also a presence in the Arctic Council, not as a state, but as an indigenous peoples and have voice also there. Another thing that I wanted to say is that now, in the context of the green transition and in the world seeking for new materials to get out from the fossil fuel-based economy and enter into a more into a world powered by other types of energy. The Arctic is increasingly seen as a storage of resources that can fuel the new energy or green energy. For example, it is known that it's rich in rare earth minerals like cobalt, nickel, and that are going to be powering for example, the new electric cars or batteries or mobiles. So the Arctic is increasingly an area of attention for countries. So there are many states that have a status of observers states in the Arctic. One of them is China, who has claimed itself being a near Arctic state, and there are other states in Europe, in Japan, Korea, South Korea, and that are claiming increasingly a role, a say in the Arctic, which is, I will come back to that later, but it's just to give you an idea of how it is the governance in the Arctic. So coming back to the point is, my paper question, in international law, what is the role of nature? And it departs from a critical point of view where it criticizes international law, and particularly in this case, international environmental law as an utilitarian regime, anthropocentric and external market-based approach to nature. So what I want to transmit here is how this has been presented. The international legal system has grown and flourished decoupled from nature, despite of being an integral part of human life and thus of living in society. Western thought-based international law reflects an intrinsic misconception of nature, where this is represented as an external object with the instrumental function of satisfying human needs, oriented to unlimited economic growth. Relevant international legal regimes, such as international environmental law, which, by the way, is the international legal regime dedicated to the protection of the environment, presents humans as separate and hierarchically superior to nature, and as such entitled to exploit it. So such misunderstanding of the natural world inserted in international law and in its regimes, like international environmental law, enables a harmful relational approach that legitimizes nature's exploitation and promotes a pernicious patterns of production, of consumption, at the core of the climate and ecological crisis that the environmental legal systems are intending to tackle. So it's a paradox. The Arctic is not an exception to this reality, to this approach to nature, and its consequences are particularly impacting the Arctic. The Arctic ecosystems and peoples are particularly vulnerable to the increasingly rapid and severe effects of climate change in the Arctic. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Arctic is warming 2-3 times faster than the rest of the world. More subsequent studies have determined that the Arctic is even warming 4 times faster than in the rest of the world. And that is not the problem of the Arctic, of Arctic states only. This has an impact in the rest of the world, as it has been said, through the cryosphere that determines, for example, sea level rise across the world. So policies on state-led solutions to the Arctic like sustainable development frameworks, like in sustainable development approaches to nature, are also harming and legitimizing an exploitation, an extractive approach to nature, including in the context of the green transition. The Arctic is one of the, as I said, one of the most vulnerable ecosystems in the world, and far of being a harsh, empty and white environment covered by snow, is the home of many of peoples, of indigenous peoples, but also non-indigenous people, and it is also home of multiple ecosystems and ecosystems that are formed by that are forming and shaping and being affected by the impacts of industrial consumption and production in the rest of the world. So this utilitarian approach challenges or contains an anthropocentric view of the natural world. In this view, I will, can we go to the next? So I want to delimit what is anthropocentrism. Yes, please, next one.
Sorry.
Yes, please, thank you. So the in the anthropocentric view, this anthropocentrism is a philosophical viewpoint arguing that human beings are the central or most significant entities in the world. This is basic belief embedded in many Western religions and philosophy. So what the approach to being taken in this research is developing, in the context of the Arctic, a post-human approach to nature in international law, a new way of thinking nature in the relationship human-nature. And in this context, it wants to, as it has been said also in other presentations, it wants to provide a wider view than the Western, the Eurocentric view that international law reflects in the multiple international legal system, in particularly in this case in international environmental law, and wants to provide a wider view of it, for which indigenous people's knowledge has been identified as one of the best candidates to provide non-anthropocentric or less anthropocentric views to nature. Also, it has been what it wants is to tackle the main challenges of this state-centric approach to nature, where the state is the one who governs nature and provides this approach where nature is appropriable and I think there is a previous one. I think in a previous one, please. Yes, more. Yes. So basically, it wants to tackle this approach to nature, where land is valuable. The value of land is because it's appropriable and exploitable. And this has been approach to nature is intertwined with the current human processes of colonization and also neoliberalism. So this result that we have in tangible international law is the reflection of this evolving humanity process intertwined, as I said, in neoliberalism and colonization. So being the Arctic considered the laboratory of the Anthropocene, so where the impacts, the most serious impacts of climate change being reflected in the Arctic first. It could be also the Arctic space where the challenges or the new approaches to nature start to emerge. In that sense, the knowledge of indigenous people in the Arctic, like Sami people, it is important. So can you go to the next, please? So the next, please. So so in the Sami cosmology of conception of nature, everything is connected, and it has the concept of sustainability is different to what we are being taught and said about sustainability, what means to be sustainable. There is a conception of respect for nature, care for nature, and also reasonableness. So taking reasonable what you need from nature. So this is an important value that is incepted in Sami's approach to nature. Is a population mainly dedicated to reindeer herding. And in this case, there is a mutual relationship where while humans provide care and food to reindeer, the reindeer also provides other means of subsistence to the human. And this is a relationship, a reciprocity relationship. This means in the Arctic indigenous environment, equality with nature. You only take what you need from it. This is totally different to what is incepted in international law, that nature is there to be compartmentalized and accordingly exploited by the human to generate economic growth. And this is supported by other complementary policy frameworks, like, for example, international development frameworks and sustainable development frameworks. So according to scholars, some indigenous scholars, there is a lot to learn from the Sami. They have the traditional ecological knowledge. They really know about nature. They have the most precise knowledge about the weather conditions, about the plants, the diet, the resources in the Arctic. The Sami people have an ethical relationship with nature, a respect for nature that also has a spiritual side. This is not embraced by international law in international environmental law. Also, I would like to make the disclaimer that in the context of the Convention on the CBD, the Convention on Biodiversity, there are some early signals of change in this approach, and indigenous peoples taking a more co-production of knowledge in the legal frameworks in the international environmental law dedicated to biodiversity. But still the main approach is this anthropocentric. So just the previous one, please. Yes, the previous. Yeah, that one. So I wanted to point out that in the case of the Arctic, that now the sea levels are rising, the ice is melting in the Arctic. There are increasing interest of going to the Arctic because the states that before couldn't go there or had more difficulties to enter into the Arctic and to access to its marine and land resources now have more access because the ice, they don't need these big ships, ice-breaking ships, but they can more easily cross. So this is under this understanding of nature is providing more access to resources which are to be exploited, which is at the core of the climate crisis that these green transition policies are trying to tackle. So that is the paradox of climate change. In the Arctic it's going to be in an additional vulnerable state because of this approach that is being taken now. So basically, in the last slide, please, to wrap up, what's from an academic perspective I would like to make is to develop a post-anthropocentric approach to nature reflected in international environmental law. And what I claim is not post-anthropocentric doesn't mean to stop being anthropocentric, because that is the nature, and trying to see nature through a different eyes than from the anthropos view would be misleading. but actually what we need to integrate is the views, a planetary view of the world that integrates not only human at the top of it and as a master from nature, but as integrated from nature, as we see in the second picture. So international law is part of the planetary problem that it intends to overcome, as it reflects a misunderstanding of nature in the human role vis-a-vis the natural world, grounded on unsighted anthropocentrism, deprived from ecological awareness. So what a post-anthropocentric approach to nature intends to do, reflected in international law, is integrating an ecological awareness in the knowledge of nature. And I finish with a remark from the social ecology perspective of Murray Bookchin that says, the great project of our time must be to open the other eye, to see all-sidedly and wholly, to heal and transcend the cleavage between humanity and nature that came with early wisdom. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marlene, for your presentation, and thank you for the wonderful quote at the end. Very beautiful. Now we move to the last presentation. We have two authors who wrote the paper. I don't know if both of them are going to present, if they are in the room. Can you raise your hand?
Yes, we are here. We both are going to present, Chair.
Okay. Perfect. So let me introduce you. Annette Lansing is Research Associate at the Ismail Mahomed Center for Human and People's Rights at the University of Venda, South Africa. She holds a law degree from the universities in South Africa and the Netherlands. She served for 10 years as the Dean of the School of Law of the University of Venda. She has extensive experience in higher education, management, and scholarly interest in decolonization and epistemologies of the South. Ademola Oluporode Yeged is a professor and interim director of the Ismail Mahomed Center for Human and People's Rights at the University of Venda, South Africa. He holds law degrees from the universities in Nigeria and South Africa. He's highly rated and internationally recognized scholar in the field of environmental law and human rights law. His PhD was on the human rights implications of the regulatory framework of climate change and indigenous peoples' lands in Africa. So thank you for being here today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mariana. My name is Annette Lansing. You've introduced me. Thank you very much. I will be co-presenting with my colleague, Professor Ademola Jegede. The title of our presentation is Whose Game Is It? Coloniality and the Voices of IPLC on Climate Justice in Africa. I will start to set the context of a decolonial or post-colonial approach that is required to acknowledge historical colonial injustices and address issues of epistemic injustice within this field. The argument...
I'm sorry, Annette, do you have video? Can you switch your video or you cannot?
Sorry?
Switch on video. I'm sorry.
Can you...
We cannot see you.
Could you try it again, please?
Do you have your video?
For a PowerPoint. Video.
No, sorry, we don't have a PowerPoint. Thank you.
And I don't know if you want to appear on the screen with your face. Is it okay without video? Est-ce que quelqu'un veut lui demander si elle veut apparaître en vidéo?
Would you like to appear so that we can see you? Is it fine like this with your video on?
Maybe later.
Okay.
Yeah, yes, if that's all right.
Please go on. Thank you.
Otherwise, yes, thank you very much. The argument made in our paper is that there is a mere integration of adding on of indigenous knowledges would not suffice. There should be an intercultural dialogue that recognizes a multiplicity of voices in a polyepistemic world with a deeper understanding of different cosmologies that does not regard nature as the property of humans. This requires a paradigm shift and would enhance finding solutions to address the devastating impacts of climate change in Africa. I would like to start with adding that anti-colonial, post-colonial, decolonial theories overlap, but need to be distinguished. African anti-colonial writings preceded post-colonial and decolonial theories. At least from the very beginning of the 20th century, from the birth of Pan-African movements, the contribution from Pixley Isaka Seme in 1906 and the establishment of literary and ideological movements, African writers, lawyers, intellectuals made their marks in the development of a discourse against colonialism. This included the philosophical construct of negritude as a vehicle for Black identity and solidarity in the 1940s in France by Black Francophone intellectuals such as Aimé Césaire and Léopold Sédar Senghor, later president of Senegal. Other anti-colonial intellectual contributions included those from the philosopher kings like Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, and Nelson Mandela. Frantz Fanon, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and Steve Biko were among the many anti-colonial writers, intellectuals, and philosophers who combined the struggle for liberation, anti-hegemonic and anti-imperialist thinking and activism with Black consciousness. While post-colonialism is often associated with the writings of Edward Said and subsequently writings by Homi Bhabha and Gayatri Spivak in India, America, United States, and the subaltern studies movement, coalescing around cultural studies and literary theory, decoloniality emerged in Latin America with the writings of Cuyano, Walter Mignola, and Maria Legones in diverse fields as sociology, philosophy, and decolonial feminism. And other writers such as Cross-Fugel, Nelson, Maldonado, Nado, Torres were all argued for an epistemological break with the colonial worldview and Western structures with its concomitant economic neo-colonialism. So there is an overlap, but in a way there are also different histories to the African anti-colonial and post-colonial movements and thoughts compared to, in particular, the Latin American movements on decolonial theories in later years. In the context of Africa, Achille Mbembe asserts that Africa was an invention as absolute otherness. Otherness, discrimination, and dispossession of land was not limited to San and Hu, the First Nations, because in 1913, the Land Act prohibited all Africans to buy, hire, or sell any land other than from other Africans. As the lawyer and a writer, Tembeka Nkwaitobi, indicates, the result was that Africans were evicted at the whim of the government or any other white person. Their property or cattle confiscated, and overnight Black people were converted into a class of laborers. Thus, a decolonial or anti-colonial analysis should start from the colonial conquest. It is at this very moment that coloniality starts operating openly and surreptitiously, seeping into the minds of the colonizer and colonized alike. The colonized becomes the other who does not enjoy the same rights and privileges as the settler colonialist. And this system was fine-tuned by imperialist legislation and later apartheid legislation that created a pool of laborers for the economy, without any regard to the destructive impact on the lives and livelihoods of the entire African population, and not only First Nation. And I think I should explain that when we talk about indigenous peoples, there are contestations in the context of Africa about indigenous as populations and local communities. We use it in the paper in a specific context, like the African Working Commission has also indicated, but this is not without, as I said, contestations about the use of the word indigenous. because in the African context, indigenous is not only First Nations, but is regarded all African people on the continent and also in the diaspora. So indigenous peoples in that context were the people who were original native to the land that was colonized by the colonial powers in the 16th and 17th century, which means the African population in Africa. Indigenous law, when we refer to indigenous law, we refer to African custom, and it's not limited to only First Nations. The First Nations, the first peoples in Southern Africa, are the San and the Khoi peoples. Before colonization, they lived in Southern Africa from the Cape to Angola and Malawi, and currently live in the Kalahari Basin in Namibia, South Africa, Botswana, and Angola. They have lived there for thousands of years, and they came before Bantu-speaking Africans from East and Central Africa moved into Southern Africa. Because of colonialism, as I said, this is contested of limiting specific rights only to First Nations in terms of indigenous populations. However, we will use for this paper as the African Commission Working Group on Indigenous Population and Communities approach, which uses the following criteria: self-definition as indigenous, as distinctly different from other groups within the state. Special attachment to and use of the traditional land, whereby the ancestral land and territory has a fundamental importance for their collective physical and cultural survival as peoples. And experience of subjugation, marginalization, dispossession, exclusion or discrimination, because these people have different cultures, ways of life, modes of production than a national hegemonic or dominant model. So we adopt in this paper this, but then with the, as I said, note that this is a contested territory. So what are we saying in our paper? In the first place, that we argue for a matter of justice to recognize indigenous knowledges. It is an effort to make right after the epistemicide, the destruction of indigenous knowledge by colonial powers. In our paper, we are advocating for a polyepistemic world that is in search of knowledge equity. Secondly, it is also more effective if indigenous populations and local communities are involved in environmental justice concerns, because they are more affected because of their close connection to the land, and the land is their livelihood. Research has also shown that indigenous populations and local communities do better at combating climate change and protecting biodiversity. This makes their participation not only a matter of justice, but also a matter of necessity. Because of the active role of stakeholders, international organizations, intergovernmental organizations have started to recognize indigenous population and local communities, IPLC, as participants. While all the countries are experiencing the adverse effects of climate change, the global south, of course, is disproportionately affected by the carbon emissions, mainly emanating from the global north. In particular, indigenous people, because of their unique land use and tenure system, and they are the least responsible for climate change, but they are the most affected. Significantly, state parties to the Paris Agreement have recognized indigenous peoples and vulnerable communities when they committed themselves to, and I'm quoting, respect, promote, and consider their respective obligations on human rights, the right to health, the rights of indigenous people and local communities and other vulnerable groups. This requires not only focus on the effect of climate change on vulnerable communities, but also how their rights can and should be used to combat climate change, as John Knox, the former United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, has pointed out. So the concept of climate justice is taking center stage as the implementation plan of the Conference of State Parties, the COP27 held at Sharm el-Sheikh, specifically notes the importance of climate justice It emphasizes that climate action should be implemented in a manner that is just and inclusive, and recognizes the fundamental priority of safeguarding food security and ending hunger. The state parties to COP27 agree that climate adaptation should address the synergy of the global crisis of climate change and the loss of biodiversity, and recognizes, and I'm quoting, the importance of ensuring the integrity of all ecosystems, including a forest, ocean, cryosphere, and the protection of biodiversity, recognized by some cultures as Mother Earth. This trend of emerging recognition continued when at the end of last year, some parties to COP28 recognized a global vision of living in harmony with nature and the integrated implementation of national climate and biodiversity frameworks. While not agreed by all parties, at least 18 parties to the Paris Agreement, Convention on Biological Diversity, and the Kunming-Montreal Global Diversity Framework issued a joint statement on climate, nature, and people, which serves to guide the national determined contributions that each state has to work on, and national biodiversity plans and strategies. These parties to this joint statement recognize the growing impacts of climate change, which threatens biodiversity and the livelihoods dependent on high integrity ecosystem, which impedes sustainable development, agree to fostering greater synergy, I'm quoting, integration and alignment in the implementation of national climate, biodiversity, and land restoration plans and strategies. And here, which is important, they recognize the full, actable, inclusive, and effective participation of indigenous peoples, local communities, women, girls, youth, and other vulnerable communities in the planning of climate and biodiversity strategies. So this joint statement notes the importance of nature-based solutions and ecosystems, and encourages, now, and I'm going to just finish now, so that I give Adi an opportunity to speak. Let me quickly. So I think maybe I should leave it here, and then as to say that this joint statement is a good step in the right direction towards a paradigm shift, which draws upon traditional knowledges and recognizes indigenous cosmovisions such as Mother Earth, and recognizes the importance of plurality, which of course then becomes the decolonial way of dealing with forms of knowledge. Adi will speak now, but I think what maybe in the questions we can discuss something about participation and consent. Do indigenous people need to consent or only consulted? How are their voices heard, and whose voices are privileged? Thank you very much. To my colleague Ademola.
Yeah, thank you, Annette. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thanks so much for your presentation. I think you have said a lot, so I just want to add a few to what you have said, just to put some practical sense to your presentation. I think ideally what we're saying, trying to say in the context of our presentation, is that when we look at post-colonial states in Africa, it has, in a way, essentially extended the colonial attitude of, discrimination and exclusion against indigenous peoples. So the post-colonial state, post-colonies in Africa are merely an extension of the ideologies that were, prevailing in the colonial states, particularly in the context of indigenous peoples and, issues relating to climate justice. Why do I say this? When you look at the institutions existing in post-colonial states, as well as the principles that are at work, principles such as, the principle of terra nullius, which ordinarily were used in those days to deprive indigenous peoples of their lands. Those principles, in a subtle way, or even forceful way, are still at work in most part of Africa. And we can see this in three tensions. the way they play out in three tensions. I will call them three tensions: the tension in relation to their identity, tension in relation to their territory, and of course, tension relating to distributive justice. What do I mean by tension in relation to the identity? States in Africa, generally struggle with the idea of recognizing indigenous people, and that goes into how they are treated in climate change discourse, affecting their lack of, effective participation at that level. And you can tell that if they can't effectively participate at that level, it will also affect, the benefits, that the discourse will easily be, affording them. So states struggle with that recognition, recognizing their identity. Most states do feel that all Africans are indigenous, to Africa, and that the whole concept of indigenous people is Western, is Eurocentric. It has no bearing in Africa because we are all indigenous. So that some states, for instance, even sort of criminalize, identifying yourself as a particular group. As example is Rwanda, where you just have to identify yourself as a Rwandese, not as a Batwa or as a Tutsi or as a Batwa or as a Tutsi or as a Hutu. So you just have to say you are. So that agenda of nationalism again, as beautiful as it is in its face, is an agenda that undermines the self-determination of indigenous people, particularly the Batwas in Rwanda. And I can go on and on to give other examples in other parts of Africa where such agenda is being used to slowly kill the whole idea of indigenous people. Recognizing indigenous people. So we also have territory tension in the sense that, as the previous presenters have said, most of the resources that are necessary to for developmental purposes in the states in Africa, and of course also to the global agenda in fighting climate change, they exist on indigenous people's lands in Africa. So, and because of that, states find it convenient to favor state ownership of land over group ownership of land, which again is a threat to indigenous people conceptualization of land. And the argument of state is often that, okay, you should know you own land. What are your proof? Where are the documented evidence to show that you own it? And because we know largely the tenure of indigenous people in relation to their land is often informal and it's not formal, mostly. And because of that, the understanding is that their land is just free to be taken up. Government can sell the land, acquire it on the ground of public policy for different reasons. At times for no reason at all. At times they say, okay, it's for developmental purposes. What you see happening is just, converting to housing estates. And once those lands are converted to housing estates or other estates, you see those who really are benefiting from it will be the highlights. So those are the issues. And the issue of distributive justice too, because, this relocation, acquisition, and fictions that characterize the attitude of government towards indigenous peoples in Africa often have the consequence too of neglecting them when it comes to accessing benefits that emanate from such implementation of such projects. And this is very important when we talk about climate justice, because as one of past speakers said, that some of these resources like cobalt, like lithium, that are very useful when we talk about alternative energy sources or clean energy, as they say, they are from these people's land, and the way and manner in which these resources are extracted actually show that there's nothing like green energy. There's nothing like there's nothing like, the alternative energy is even worse. When we look at the way in DRC Congo, for instance, and some part of the Central African Republic, how these resources that are very crucial to climate change agenda have been extracted. They're extracted in a way that, undermine the dignity of the indigenous people living in those areas. They're extracted in a way that, bring them no benefit. So these are the issues that, these are the tensions and the issues that support the idea that, nothing has changed much. Nothing has changed at the state level in terms of how the post-colonial state is addressing issues, pertaining to indigenous people, particularly in the context of climate change. So now, and it often these tensions often play out in their lack of recognition, lack of FPIC in terms of implementation of these projects. Because as we know, indigenous peoples have their own unique organizations, traditions, and way they want to be consulted. So government often do FPIC in a what do you call it now? In a tick box, following tick box approach. It was never done. At times, when consent is paraded as being obtained, you often discover that such consent is forced. It's not voluntary. There's nothing like, they are not well informed, if ever they are consulted, which is why what Annette was talking about, participation. Actually, participation is so key. The participation it should be the ideological framework within which this FPIC, operates. And the way it is now, FPIC is often overshadowing, the concept of participation, which is key. And I think that is so important when we talk about our indigenous people. I'm rounding up. Then then there's also it also play out in the form of lack of recognition of protocol of engagement of indigenous people. When indigenous people have tried to develop their own protocol in terms of how they wish to engage in relation to their land and resources, government and other external stakeholders have often neglected it. So which again is very problematic in Africa. Because, we know, I think within the regime of biodiversity, CBD, the Convention on Biodiversity, within that regime, biocultural protocols are recognized. They are a very useful way of, engaging with, communities in relation to, biodiversity resources. But in my experience, we've tried to sort of work with indigenous people to ensure that they develop these protocols. But the reality is that government doesn't recognize it. They try as much as possible to force the state-centered, legislation. That has retained that colonial sentiment. They force it on indigenous people. As we speak in South Africa, the indigenous people in the West, in the Western Cape, they are trying to sort of develop protocol in relation to the Table Mountain. People talk about Table Mountain, but they don't know that these mountains are actually territories of indigenous people, the Khoya and the Sans. And people go there, tourists go there, they spend a lot of that. Where does the money go to? Where does this benefit go to? These people are neglected when it comes to access and benefit sharing. So these are all the issues that that are playing out in post-colonial Africa that were around the assertion that nothing much has changed. But at the regional level and at the international level, things are changing. As we have seen, the African Commission has come up with the criteria of determining who the indigenous people is, and they have done so in Hendro's case. They have done so in Ogiek case, which Ogiek case was decided by the African Court, which issued binding decisions. The Hendros was decided by the African Commission, which is recommendatory in terms of its decisions. But then these two cases are authoritative decisions that do show that indigenous people's concerns should be addressed in African context. But the question is, how does state view this decision? We see this tension between state recognition of even these decisions as it applies to indigenous people in terms of their implementation. So I think the way forward is for states to open up to development at regional and international level.
If you could move to the conclusions.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing now. So that's why I'm saying that So finally, the way out is for the state to open up to development at the regional and international level in relation to indigenous peoples and to sort of imbibe principles emanating from that in climate change context. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Ademola.
Yeah.
And thank you, Annette, for the wonderful presentation. I think it complements very well. Now we move from Africa to the Arctic and to the other regions of the world. Now I would like to give the floor to Leslie Cloud, who is in the room and is going to offer a few remarks and comments on the three papers. Leslie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Voy a hablar en español porque parece que hay más personas que hablan español en la sala. Y primero entonces voy a felicitar a los tres panelistas, los cuatro panelistas, los dos que están en línea y los dos que están en la sala, por su muy rica presentación sobre el conocimiento, la epistemología de los pueblos indígenas y su aporte para enfrentar los desafíos de nuestras sociedades y de nuestro planeta. Sus conclusiones conjuntas subrayan la necesidad de un cambio de paradigma en la relación, la concepción de la naturaleza y en particular, en especial el derecho internacional del medio ambiente, de relaciones con los saberes indígenas en una perspectiva de decolonización. Entonces, en esa breve discusión, para dejarle a usted posibilidad de preguntas, voy solo a enfatizar en los puntos en comunes de sus ponencias, subrayar algunas problemáticas que me parece aparecen de esas temáticas. Como lo subrayaron, los saberes, conocimientos, modos de evaluación de medidas de regulación de los pueblos indígenas son pertinentes para enfrentar esos desafíos. Como lo subrayó Yolanda, es posible una verdadera transformación al restaurar, revitalizar y reencontrar los conocimientos indígenas y preservar el modo de pensar indígena. Marlene también subrayó la relación de reciprocidad y espiritualidad con la naturaleza. Esa relación al final son reflejos de los principios fundamentales del derecho propio indígena. Esto también significa que los saberes están vinculados al derecho propio indígena y que protegen uno y dar permiso también a que el otro se puede ejercer. También subrayaron la problemática de la representación, de la justa participación de los pueblos indígenas al cambio, de la soberanía sobre los recursos naturales, de compartir los beneficios, la criminalización de los pueblos indígenas y la persistencia y la acumulación de las violencias coloniales. Todo eso también están vinculados con la sobrevivencia y la cabida que se le da a los saberes de los pueblos indígenas. También subrayaron la insuficiente consideración de los conocimientos saberes, que están nombrados saberes tradicional en oposición a los saberes científicos. En sí, el concepto de saber es un concepto grande, porque hasta el pueblo indígena, el sabio es una persona con rango alto. El problema entonces no es tanto de llamarlos saberes tradicionales, ancestral, como sea, pero tiene que ver con el lugar, la legitimidad y la autoridad inferior que se le da a esos saberes y también al derecho propio indígena que sustenta esos saberes. Eso tiene consecuencias para los pueblos indígenas mismos y sus territorios y también para los otros ecosistemas, porque todo está interconectado y cuando protegen, hacen valer su derecho propio sobre su territorio y si no se hace lo mismo entre los otros territorios, se contamina. Entonces, a título de discusión, solamente quiero subrayar temáticas sobre el peligro y la ilegalidad de la marginalización de los saberes indígenas. Y también del peligro, no sé por qué no se me escucha, ¿o sí? Sí. Y también el peligro de la marginalización de la participación y la ilegalidad de la marginalización de la participación de los pueblos indígenas en la toma de decisiones. Por ejemplo, como se lo demostró Marlene, el derecho del medio ambiente en su concepción, en su paradigma, tiene que seguir el leve proceso de descolonización que ya está en camino pero la cuestión indígena sigue siendo desconocida o mal interpretada por el derecho ambiental, con apropiación también mal hábil que tienden a distribuir la cuestión indígena en sus intereses. Como ejemplo, podemos ver el tema cuando se ganó el fallo de la Corte Suprema en Brasil sobre el marco temporal. Mucha gente defensor del medio ambiente estaba feliz porque era una lucha contra Monsanto, con el monocultivo. Pero aparte de eso, era una lucha para el genocidio, contra el genocidio para preservar la vida y los territorios. Y todavía no se entendía, ese peso se apropió, a mi modo de entender, esa lucha propia de los pueblos indígenas que eran para todos. Y también el peligro de la marginalización, que son en riesgo la lucha misma por el cambio climático, la transición energética, el equilibrio de los ecosistemas. Está en peligro si se marginaliza la transmisión, porque si los jóvenes, si están al margen, los jóvenes no van a valorizar los saberes indígenas. Y entonces hay riesgo, como lo subrayaba Yolanda, de erosión, de desaparición de los saberes, de los mecanismos de transmisión. Y entonces peligro para la gobernanza alimenticia, la salud global, y el impacto también sobre la transmisión y preservación de la lengua y espiritualidad indígena que están vinculadas con esos saberes. Injusticia entonces medioambiental de muchas facetas, y también se subrayó el vínculo muy importante entre los saberes y la protección de los territorios. Se habló de la navegación, pero hay pueblos indígenas que ya no que tenían todo su saber sobre el mar, pero ya no tienen permiso de navegación. Entonces ya no pueden transmitir su conocimiento tan valuable. E ilegalidad, en fin, porque ya ha estado conocido el derecho a la autodeterminación de los pueblos indígenas. Ya hablamos del derecho al consentimiento, o sea, la participación en todas las tomas de decisión. Entonces, mantener al margen los saberes indígenas es ilegal. Es ilegal porque los pueblos indígenas tienen derecho al consentimiento, y también hay riesgos hoy día a la propiedad intelectual de los saberes de los pueblos indígenas.
Sí.
Entonces, de esos puntos quería subrayar y decir que ya hay iniciativas muy interesantes que se están desarrollando. Hay un proyecto de investigación, se llama Aramat. Aramat es un proyecto de investigación liderado por investigadores indígenas, tiene un gran proyecto ya sobre la salud indígena, la protección de la biodiversidad, y ya alcanzaron un convenio con la Organización Panamericana de la Salud. Y hay muchos ejemplos de ese índole, y que falta que haya entonces difusión, que la ciencia se abre en la academia. Y entonces les agradezco por su ponencia tan importante, y ojalá, prefiero que en la sala si hay preguntas, comentarios, no sé si Mariana te dejo volver al líder, ¿no? Gracias.
Thank you, Leslie, for the comments. Now we will open the floor for questions. If we can collect 2 or 3 questions in the room. If people want also to ask something in the chat, I'm also looking at it. So please feel free to ask it in Spanish, in French, or in English.
Good morning, Aski Sumauru, as we said in Aymara. I would like to share 2 questions that we have formulated inside my community. And here they are. First, if the indigenous knowledge or indigenous science could be understood both, how to preserve it if many of the indigenous practices, I mean the rituals, must be an experience more than a data or indexed guiding knowledge to the rest of the society. And second, understanding indigenous knowledge or indigenous people's science is relevant to address both climate and biodiversity emergencies. How to be evaluated by the general society if this knowledge have to be experienced more than being scientific writing. Thank you.
Yolanda, ¿tiene la respuesta?
¿Esta vez sí respondo en español?
Súper.
Sí. Yo creo que primero hay que establecer que el conocimiento indígena tiene varias dimensiones y que van desde lo local hasta lo global, en el sentido de que lo local es el conocimiento muy localizado y lo global, que es lo más como las cosmovisiones, las formas de ver y de pensar el mundo, más desde la parte espiritual. Y es un paradigma diferente al de la ciencia occidental. Estos dos paradigmas nunca se van a cruzar porque la forma en la que se ve la naturaleza son totalmente diferentes. En una, la naturaleza se ve, que lo mencionó aquí la compañera, como algo que puede ser explotado o algo que no tiene valor. Y en el paradigma indígena, la naturaleza es, honestamente, lo más importante que tenemos los pueblos indígenas para sobrevivir varias generaciones. Y en relación a tu pregunta de cómo hacer que esté la parte de la experiencia en la actividad occidental, es posible que nunca la haya. Pero eso no quiere decir que no funcionen los dos paradigmas juntos para comprender el funcionamiento del mundo, para respetar y valorar la naturaleza. No sé si me voy a entender, o sea, muchas veces queremos que estos dos paradigmas estén en una línea, nunca lo van a estar, a menos que la ciencia occidental respete la naturaleza como los pueblos indígenas la respetamos. Y es ahí donde viene la parte de la experiencia, de los valores, de la ética ambiental, que muchas veces no se tiene en el otro paradigma. Y no se trata de trabajar solamente los datos, sino que puedes obtener datos, no sé, del mundo, de los fenómenos naturales, pero sin el componente espiritual, muchas veces no vamos a lograr ese camino a la transformación, a la sostenibilidad. ¿Sí entiendes? O sea, como desde mi punto de vista, si no desarrollamos esa relación, ese componente cultural o espiritual hacia la naturaleza, de manera individual, muy probablemente no vamos a ser capaces de generar esto adentro para proteger algo que simplemente no consideramos valioso para nuestra sobrevivencia. ¿Respondí a tu pregunta?
Gracias.
Chair, may I
Sí.
add something to that?
Mariana, ¿puedo agregar algo brevemente? ¿Sí? Sí, me parece muy importante tu pregunta y de hecho tu respuesta es bastante completa. Solamente quería agregar que sí, que esta pregunta, esta interrogante creo que es bastante legítima y bastante común entre las poblaciones indígenas y también entre las, digamos, aquellos que quieren integrarla de alguna forma, pero existe eso, que no necesariamente hay que absorberlo o tratar de integrarlo, pero considerarlo sobre todo desde el punto de vista legal, que al final es normativo y dinámico, pero al mismo tiempo estático, que pueda incorporarse esa visión más multidimensional de la naturaleza que existe en los pueblos indígenas y que ciertamente no existe en este sistema internacional legal eurocéntrico en que se ha, y como mencionaba, se ha creado, fortalecido y desarrollado desde un punto de vista utilitario de la naturaleza, donde es instrumental para los fines de apropiación de la naturaleza y está mezclado con todo el proceso de colonización y neoliberal, donde la naturaleza es un medio para lograr el fin del desarrollo entendido desde la concepción pues neoliberal. Y una cosa que quería remarcar, que lo dije el otro día, pero me pareció bastante importante desde otro tipo desde desde una investigadora en en la zona de los Himalayas, en lo que es en Nepal, decía esto, hablando del conocimiento sobre los glaciares en los Himalayas y cómo este se transmitía. Según la tradición, ahí la persona que más sabía en su comunidad sobre los glaciares era una persona que tenía más de 112 años, o alrededor de 112 años. ¿Y cómo había adquirido ese conocimiento de los glaciares? Pues más o menos alrededor de 80 años de observación de los mismos, y por ejemplo, uno de los conocimientos adquiridos era que los glaciares en la región de los Himalayas, incluso para entenderlo a nuestro entender, se podían casar o te podían formar parejas. Eso era parte del conocimiento, pero ella decía, por ejemplo, esto, ¿cómo lo transmites para el conocimiento del cambio climático y la importancia que tienen la criosfera y los glaciares para el ecosistema a nivel global? Entonces, ella decía, la pregunta que importante aquí es, ¿quién es el experto realmente? ¿O quién produce la ciencia? ¿O qué métodos son validados para producir la ciencia? ¿O qué es considerado ciencia? Entonces, ahí entramos otra vez en esa disyuntiva de qué consideramos y qué no validamos. Entonces, para eso creo que es importante lo que ha dicho Yolanda, de que quizás también hay que asumir que no se pueden integrar, pero sí considerar ambas, y de alguna manera poder, una no desconocer a la otra, sino que haya de alguna forma una complementariedad. No sé si a eso se podría aspirar. Gracias.
Thank you, Marlene. Now, I think Annette wanted to offer a remark. Annette, do you hear me? I think.
Yes, I do. Sorry.
Oh.
Sorry, Chair. Sorry, I was on the other channel listening to the translation. So I'm struggling with a number of screens. Thank you very much. I would like to add indeed that, in our paper, for example, we say we cannot just add and consult indigenous people, but it's not only about participation, but it's really about much deeper understanding of different cosmovisions. To view the nature not only as property as it has been, in a Western-oriented dominant system, but it requires us a far more radical paradigm shift. And that is why decolonial and anti-colonial writings are so important in the context of indigenous people, because we cannot only look at, as Ade already indicated, my colleague Ademola, a ticking of the boxes, because we need to, in our language, it's not only about translation, languages also convey different meanings and attitudes, a far deeper understanding. So in the African context, for example, we talk about Ubuntu, which is an ontological and epistemological category, it is argued, of the African peoples. So it is much deeper philosophically than participation within an already set framework, but it is about shifting radically to a deeper understanding of indigenous populations and their culture and traditional knowledges. Thank you.
Thank you, Annette. And Jessica just informed me that we have 15 more minutes, so we can have more questions. If anyone has questions in the room, you can proceed. No? So I have actually many questions. So for me, all the presentations were very interesting, but I would like to make one to Yolanda and Marlene, and then I'll make a second one to Ademola. So my first question is that 2 weeks ago, we had the historical approval of the World OMP, the WIPO agreement on traditional knowledge and genetic resources. So as you might know, this agreement was in negotiation since 2001. And it involved also the indigenous peoples movement internationally. They were there by the time of approval. So my question to Yolanda and Marlene is that if the approval of this agreement is not yet into force, but it's approved, if this changes anything regarding your conclusions, or if you think that we can have more hope in the recognition of traditional knowledge with the approval of this treaty, if you could say words on that. And to Ademola, my question would be, you mentioned the ongoing development of protocols by indigenous communities in Africa. This is really a big trend here in Brazil. There are a lot of indigenous and Afro-descendant communities approving protocols, and on the basis of that, they negotiate with transnational companies and with the state. Is it also the case in Africa, or how is it? Is it comparable? Is it not yet there? So how do you see the development of protocols in the African context? So if Yolanda would like to start, or Marlene.
Yes, indeed. My understanding is that in the creation, for example, in the Peruvian case of a database on indigenous people's knowledge at national level has been quite challenging, because, for example, indigenous peoples were highly reluctant on saving and providing their knowledge about different things, for example, from how plants could be helpful for health purposes, or the use of certain technology to address a climatic problem, etc. They were reluctant on putting their knowledge in a national official database, because of course they were one of the arguments was that this would be used for exploitation purposes, so the exploitation of knowledge and commercial use of knowledge, and how this would be handled. So basically, the database was there, but not many insights, or not as much, not tracked as much as it was expected. And so my wonder is, I think that having this treaty is a positive development. However, how it will be implemented and how this will be utilized or taken, this development, by actual indigenous people's knowledge, people who handle this knowledge, would be perceived. Because I think at international level, it could have the same repercussion, or the same perhaps perception than, for example, in this case that I say in Peru, that okay, now it's there is a treaty, but then how this knowledge would be used or misused or misinterpreted, and this could be say like, for just simple and maybe very basic examples. You have seen, I have seen and listened of talks about this, the use of ayahuasca, that now, for example, that many of us may have heard about it, and then how this is now, how people who came to experience, for example, the ayahuasca, its use in, for example, in Peru or in other countries, and then coming from, let's say, Western countries, and then how they come with resources, implement a lodge in the jungle, and they started having the mecca of ayahuasca somewhere in the jungle and using it as a commercial purposes. So these kind of things are perceived by local population like this is completely lost the point of this, and people are still coming to these places from other countries who do not have the understanding of the purposes, the meaning, the sacredness of this plant, using it and thinking we are indigenizing or respecting indigenous knowledge by doing this, while it's not actually the case. So this is just a very simple, basic example to say what might be the implications of a implementation of this treaty, for example. Thank you.
Bueno, voy a responder en español. Más que una opinión, tengo como que algunos puntos que dar. Por ejemplo, en relación a los recursos genéticos, ya hemos visto que el conocimiento de plantas o de los recursos es un conocimiento que ha sido pasado de generación a generación y ha llevado muchos años. Y yo creo que aquí existe, tenemos que tomar en cuenta que obviamente hay muchos intereses detrás de estos recursos, detrás de este conocimiento, que lo quieren obtener de una forma, o sea, ipso facto. Y no se valora, no se da realmente el valor al tiempo que los pueblos indígenas han invertido, digamos, en este laboratorio natural de probar y verificar que realmente sea este recurso el que cura esto. Ese es un punto que quiero mencionar. Otro también es que muchas veces en la firma de estos tratados, de hecho, hubo una conferencia High Level Panel en Ginebra hace un mes sobre los recursos genéticos. Muchas veces en estas negociaciones se invita a los pueblos indígenas para que aporten conocimiento, pero muchas veces todos esos tratados son escritos en una forma académica, científica, y el simple hecho de llevarlos a estas reuniones no garantiza que sus conocimientos o que sus opiniones estén realmente vertidas en el documento, en los documentos que firman las naciones. Entonces, realmente todavía no se ha logrado hacer o sea, que haya una equidad, por así decirlo, en materia de los recursos genéticos, como lo comentaban aquí con ejemplos de la ayahuasca. Y un último punto que quiero comentar también es que realmente presenté un mapa donde los pueblos indígenas representan menos del 6% del total de la población mundial. Y toda la población mundial quiere usar esos recursos genéticos. Entonces, ¿cómo está, por ejemplo, en materia del territorio? ¿Cómo estos grupos indígenas van a propiciar el crecimiento, el cuidado de esos recursos genéticos de esas plantas, si por ejemplo no tienen el territorio para hacerlo, si no tienen los derechos para tener sus propias tierras? Entonces hay muchos puntos aquí que tomar en cuenta, y realmente estamos avanzando, pero los avances yo los veo un poco lentos. O sea, aquí está el mapa donde mostraba yo dónde están las tierras manejadas, controladas por los pueblos.
Thank you,
Acá hay
Yolanda.
una pregunta.
Sorry, I think Ademola wanted to say something. Ademola, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly, except the Spanish, but I try to connect. Thank you so much for your question, Mariana. It was a wonderful question that you asked. You know, it's something trending in your part of the world, but in Africa, it seems to be an emerging trend, and it's a very useful trend too. It's a trend that Biocultural Protocol, you know, it's an acknowledgement of the right of indigenous people to self-determination. It shows that you recognize the institutions, their culture, the IKS, all these things we're talking about are so crucial, because those are the components of Biocultural Protocol, if effectively, you know, are formulated. But the reality with Africa is quite different, because, you know, this protocol often struggle with other legislation, state legislation, which makes it very difficult for this protocol to be bathed. For instance, some of the constitutions and land law, you know, or resources legislation in Africa often indicate that, you know, land resources belong to the state. And, in some constitutions to say that it belongs to the president to be held in custody, in trust for the people. So indigenous people struggle with this provision. So even when you have a protocol saying this is the way we want to be engaged, you will discover that that can also be overridden by, legislation, which, vests power in the state to have, to take whatever on the ground of, public policy and all that. But then, we keep doing this because the more the advocacy increases, the more indigenous people become conscious. In some communities, we've seen evidence of that, particularly in South Africa, where the law is a bit more liberal. But in other states in Africa, it's still a challenging stuff. But it's a product that we are trying to sell in Africa to see, okay, let's engage with these people on their own terms, in line with their culture, in line with their knowledge system and all that. So that's where we are presently. Thanks for the opportunity to speak on that. Thanks.
Thank you, Ademola. And now I think the last question in the room.
Yeah, it was
Bom dia. Bonjour. Eu vou falar, se vocês não entenderem, porque você fala português.
Si ustedes no entienden, yo puedo hacer en español o en inglés, pero yo voy a hablar en portugués. Ya.
Sobre a questão da discussão da ayahuasca, que é um processo que nós chamamos de biopirataria. E que tem acontecido muito, vou falar do Brasil, que é onde eu estou. Eu sou xamã, sou pajé, e o que nós temos percebido enquanto medicinas tradicionais, né, saberes tradicionais, é essa comercialização desenfreada e a ausência também de legislações que respaldem a própria medicina em si. Por exemplo, a gente tem a ayahuasca e a jurema, que são essas medicinas, essas plantas, são árvores, é muito mais que isso, mas que vem passando por esse processo de ecocídio. Então, nós não temos uma política efetiva que as protejam, no caso, por exemplo, das árvores, né? E os chás são feitos com algumas plantas, algumas árvores, e essas árvores estão sendo totalmente devastadas.
Okay, I will do that. Thank you.
Então, eu queria saber, assim, a nível internacional, o que a gente pode pensar com relação a isso? E, no mesmo tempo que nós temos aí a destruição, o ecocídio dessas plantas, que para nós é extremamente sagrado, e que não é qualquer pessoa, não é comercializável, porque não é qualquer empresa, né? Existe toda uma ritualística que nós aprendemos pela oralidade, que não é em livros, não é em escritos. Quais seriam os desafios e as propostas? Porque, ao mesmo tempo, essas medicinas estão sendo criminalizadas, porque as pessoas estão usando de uma forma desenfreada, sem preparo, sem cuidado, sem respeito à própria medicina, e estão falando, inclusive, que a ayahuasca tem produzido, tem gerado efeitos de saúde mental em algumas regiões do Brasil, como é o caso de São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro. E aí eu queria saber como que a gente faz, né? Porque a medicina, usa a medicina, destrói a medicina, agora a medicina é culpada, ela está provocando mal.
Perhaps it's good that if you can give a brief translation, because I think I have only English speakers as well. I mean, yes, I think it would be helpful. Just briefly, I think, to make sure that everyone is.
Well, her question, I'll try to summarize it. Yes. It's on the use of ayahuasca and what was mentioned about the cultural appropriation of ayahuasca and the use by non-indigenous people that in a way that is not connected to indigenous knowledge and indigenous knowledge systems, but also their spiritual practices. And she's using the example in Brazil, not only ayahuasca, but also jurema, which is another plant. There is a commercial use of that has been popularized outside indigenous lands, and that is causing an ecocide in a way because of how these plants are being exploited in the Amazon for this commercial use. And there is no regulations for it. There is no regulations for that use outside indigenous context. And that is also causing harmful practices because people are not using it in a not responsible way as indigenous peoples do with their knowledge of how these plants operate, not only in the body, like chemically speaking, but in other dimensions as well. And this is leading towards a pressure for criminalizing the use of these medicines, as if the problem is not the harmful use and the commercialization and the appropriation that people are using, but the medicine itself. So she's asking how international law may address this issue.
Thank you for the translation. If anyone, Yolanda, anyone wants to make
Yes.
comments on that? Okay.
So good afternoon. I'm a Filipino lawyer from the Philippines, but my research is about the use of legal protection of traditional medicinal knowledge. So it can be which needs a translation. Can somebody translate to her the one she's So I would just answer with the WIPO treaty. As of now, it's quite problematic because the disclosure requirements only states that the patent applicant should disclose if they are using the TK, a traditional knowledge or genetic resources and the source of origin. However, there is no provision regarding compensation, regarding sharing of profits, unlike the use of patent or copyright, which is very particular in terms of the commercial use. So in this treaty, I found it very lacking because aside from that, if a patent applicant forgets to state that they use TK or genetic resources of an indigenous people, they are given an opportunity to rectify, like they can correct it. But only if there is a fraudulent intent on the part of the patent applicant that this would be waived. However, this would be very problematic because proving fraudulent intent is, from an evidentiary point, the evidence is shifted to the communities to prove that the patent applicant failed to disclose this. So, in summary, I think us as advocates for indigenous peoples should continue advocating and negotiating for another treaty that would ensure the compensation and the provisional measures like confiscations, which is granted for patent applicants, which is not present for indigenous knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all the presenters for the presentations today and the participants for being here. With that, I think I close the session. I hope you enjoyed as I did, and I wish you all the best for the rest of the day and a good stay in Paris. Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye-bye. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair, and all the other presenters. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.